Maybe it's actually a me problem. Maybe I'm just easily distracted. Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to discuss every book that I did and did not read between the months of December and February. And I just want to preface this by saying that it has been an absolutely abysmal last 3 months in terms of reading for me, because I did something that I have always told myself I don't do, but somehow I did, and I've had to pay for that. I've always been a fan of DNFing books, so if I start reading a book and I don't like it, and I'm not connecting to it for whatever reason, I put it down. You see, the thing is, we're all human. And I found myself being massively influenced by the fact that so many people had read this particular book, and I wanted to read it because I really wanted to have an opinion on it, because I feel like if you don't read a book, there's only so much that you can say about a book. But in this instance, I really was so desperate to read this book and have an opinion on it that I just kept on pushing and pushing and pushing, and it put me in a massive slump that has lasted probably the last few months, and I hope I will get out of at some point, because I'm tired. It feels like the most unproductive 3 months of my life, and I'm wanting for that to change. So in this video, we're going to be talking about every book that I DNF'd, every book that I read, which aren't many, and we're going to talk about my hopes for the month coming. So if that's your vibe, please stick around. The first book that I successfully read was The Secret Lives of Country Gentlemen, and that is by K.J. Charles. This book follows Gareth and Joss. Gareth is a baronet, so he's, I suppose, a member of the aristocracy. His father has recently died and has left him a family title, a house that is not in London where he grew up, but is in Romney Marsh. So he's grappling with his father's death, as well as residual feelings about the fact that his father basically took absolutely no interest in raising him. He was raised primarily by his uncle, his father's brother, and he wasn't necessarily treated well by his uncle while he lived there, and his father just had absolutely no interest in him whatsoever. His father obviously passes away, and then he goes back to where their family manor is in Romney Marsh to deal with everything that somebody typically has to deal with when their parents pass away. And there he actually meets his half-sister and his, I suppose, stepmother, and he comes to understand the family law, if that makes any sense. And it makes him very sad, because he realizes that his father had this entire life that he didn't get to partake in, that he didn't know of, and that his half-sister, or his bonus, I suppose, bonus family, was treated well by him, but not even massively. And he also just comes to realize that his father was just a massive asshole, and he treated people terribly, and he's been left to deal with the mess of every bad decision that his father has made, and he's resentful of that, understandably. He also lost his mother at a very young age, so he also doesn't have that. It's one thing to have a father who doesn't care about you, but if you had at least one parent who was around and who did care about you, it would make things a little bit easier. But he didn't have either, because his mother had passed away. So I guess it's just dealing with, I suppose, the emotional trauma that comes from how he grew up. He had met Joss before moving back to Romney Marsh, so he and Joss were actually having an anonymous affair. They were sleeping together, but they didn't really know anything about each other except for where they were from. Gareth grew up in London and Joss grew up in Kent, so they would call each other London and Kent, which I thought was really sweet. I love a nickname in a book generally, but I especially love it when they're unique in that way. When his father passes away, he cuts things off with Joss in a very sort of brutal, rude way. And he thinks it's the end of it until he moves back to Romney Marsh, and then he sees Joss again, and then he realizes that Joss actually comes from a massive smuggling family from there. So there's really no way of avoiding him if they're going to essentially live in the same place. Gareth is struggling with adjusting to life in Romney Marsh because it's vastly different from London where he grew up, but also he is struggling to fit in with the community, because when you move to a very close-knit community and things are so massively different, it's hard to fit in. And it's especially hard to fit in if you're coming in as a baronet and people think that you're just trying to throw money around and change things to suit you and not particularly for the improvement of the community. So the people at Romney Marsh were not particularly keen on his presence there, and they let it be known. So on top of all the things that he was already struggling with, he's now struggling with essentially being an outcast. It soon becomes very clear to him that he has to make a little bit of effort to fit in, to get to know people. Like, they weren't going to just give him the acceptance that he wanted right away. There was work that he had to do. With this book, I enjoyed it and I finished it, but it took me a very long time to get into it. I have to say, I do struggle a bit with K.J. Charles's writing. And it's interesting because when I first discovered Cat Sebastian and I realized that she was one of my favorite authors, one of the very first things that I did was go to communities in which they talked about romance and ask them if there were any authors that were similar to Cat Sebastian. And a name that kept on coming up was KJ Charles. And at this point, I have probably tried quite a few of KJ Charles's books. And this is the one that I think I have read fully, because I don't know whether it's a style of writing, I don't know whether it's subject matter, I don't know whether it's the pacing. I'm not particularly sure what it is that I don't instantly connect to in the same way that I connect to Cat Sebastian's writing. So I think in this book, it kind of suffered from that in terms of, I knew that I liked the couple. I knew that I liked the dynamic. I knew that I liked, I suppose, the premise. I knew that it was interesting, but it took a lot to immerse myself in the story. And I did find myself getting taken out of it and not particularly concentrating as well as I could have, especially when there were outside factors. So in terms of other characters or subplots within the story, I would always find myself not particularly caring. I'm just like, can we get back to having Joss and Gareth together and working on their relationships? Maybe it's actually a me problem. Maybe I'm just easily distracted, or maybe I want a story that has minimal sort of subplots. I felt myself just not being fully immersed in a story in the way that I would for any sort of 4-star or 5-star read for me. So I think that was one of my struggles, but I did like it, and I particularly just loved the connection between Joss and Gareth. I think that even though this story is not my favorite, they are probably one of my favorite couples that I've ever read about. When the anonymous affair was all they had, that is before they got to know each other and where they were from or anything personal about one another, I loved their connection, because even though they were just sleeping together, there was kind of like a sweet note to the affair that they had. And when Gareth moves back to Romney Marsh and they get over their initial issues with each other and the miscommunication between them, that continued. So I love the fact that they have a very, very sweet connection. One thing about me is I just love sweetness within a relationship. If I'm going to read a romance book, there has to be sweetness, which is why I don't think I'm a dark romance girly, because I need it to be sweet. I need the emotional depth to be there. I need both characters to be reverenced, worshipped, and praised and so invested in each other. And I think Gareth and Joss definitely had that, so it did add to the excitement of the book. The misogyny was hard to read, but it was understandable for the time. It is a historical romance book, so if it's going to have any kind of accuracy, it definitely is something that would exist in a story like this. I try not to read books like these with a 2026 outlook, because otherwise you will be sorely disappointed. But yeah, I think it's just a reminder that misogyny has always been a huge part of society. I think it probably is a 3.5-star read for me, maybe a 4 on a good day, but it was good. I did enjoy it and I was able to finish it, and I think I am looking forward to reading the sequel to this story, which is The Nobleman's Guide to Seducing Scoundrel, which focuses on, I think, Joss's nephew Luke, who was a minor character in this book and somebody who really stole my heart in the story. So I'm excited to read that one day. If you have read any of KJ Charles's books, tell me what you thought about them. Like, especially the people who do like KJ Charles, but the people who maybe have read it and have struggled. What are the best books? Would you recommend anything else for me? Maybe something that's different to what this one was, just so that I can see if it's just that she's not an author for me. The next book that I successfully read was Work For It by Talia Hibbert, and this follows Griffin and Keynes. So Keynes is in a depressive episode and he's struggling with a lot. So he decides to go on holiday, or like a staycation, to another part of the UK. He goes on holiday and he meets Griffin. Griffin is obviously part of the local community. He grew up there, but he's a little bit of an outcast in terms of the fact that he was raised by a single mother who was a little bit hippy-dippy and didn't quite fit in with the very straightforward, kind of stereotypically, I guess, normal part of the community. So he just grew up being an outcast because he didn't fit into the box of what it was like to deserve, I guess, common decency and respect. He basically just kind of lives his life on autopilot in terms of the fact that he works an honest job, he has a friend, but he doesn't have much of a life. When you're reading the story, you can tell that this is a guy that could be doing so much more and just isn't, because he kind of lacks the motivation to grasp what he truly deserves. Keynes is actually mixed race. He is half black, half British, also Nigerian in particular, because his first name is Olusegun. That's a Nigerian, but in particular a Yoruba name. His mom was upper class, so he's very privileged in that regard. He went to private school and he has that sort of pedigree. Griffin is white. He grew up okay for the most part, but nothing like that. And so they meet and sparks fly. But I think the most important thing about this book is the discussion of depression. So Keen struggles with depression, and Griffin's mom also struggled with depression that ended up claiming her life. So there is a bit of that understanding between the two characters. One of the things I loved most about this book is it didn't shy away from what depression could look like for somebody. It was very real and raw. And I think sometimes when authors are depicting depression, I suppose there's this worry about being too real, in fear of maybe putting readers off or things not being as exciting as they could be. But this book really demonstrates and illustrates that you can have a really good story with depression being a very central plot. And just because somebody falls in love or they happen to find somebody they're attracted to doesn't mean that all of a sudden the depression goes away instantly. You could find yourself a bit frustrated because there is so much back and forth, so much push and pull, because you have two people who are dealing with individual trauma that are kind of scared about being in a relationship for two different reasons and in two different ways. And then they have to work through those individual issues to meet each other in the middle. And I really loved the Keen. It was very prickly, but I think he was also really likable. And I love the fact that he would often stick up for Griff, because Griff was very much kind of like a pushover. Because he had been an outcast all his life, you know, he wasn't really determined to push the envelope in terms of the kind of treatment he deserved, because he actually was being treated in the community really badly, even by his employer. And I love the fact that he had Keynes to help with that. And Keynes had someone like Griffin who was quite soft and gentle and kind to help him work through his major issues as well. I loved all the side characters, Griff's best friend, Keynes' sister and brother-in-law, the neighbors who were kind. I thought they were a really nice addition to the story. I also loved the talk about class discussion in this book, because Talia Hibbert is actually British, so she probably has an inherent understanding of the class system that exists in the UK. It wasn't a major part of the book, but it did actually make for interesting conversation within the book. It was really enjoyable. I think this is probably like a 4.5 star read. It took me quite a bit of time to get through it, because as somebody who has been through depression before, sometimes it's hard for me to read a book about a clearly depressed character. But if I know that there is depression within a story, I would say romance is definitely my genre of choice, because there is a guaranteed happy ending. And I like that feeling of knowing that even though reading this particular book is difficult, there is hope that's coming, even though it might take a while and there are so many bumps on the road that they might have. But I like the fact that I know that it's guaranteed at the end. And they did get what they wanted, and it was amazing. The best part about this book is that both main characters are so obviously far away from being perfect. But that doesn't mean that they don't deserve this good thing between them. And it was lovely to see them be able to navigate the difficulty of what it meant to let go of your fears and heal in order to get the relationship of both their dreams. I'm not surprised that I loved a Talia Hibbert book, because like I've said, she's one of my favorite authors, but I really loved it. I think this might be my second favorite Talia Hibbert book, because I think my favorite is Taking Him Danny Brown All Day Every Day, but I think this might be a close second. And it was a very accidental discovery. I didn't really do a lot of research. It was one of those books that I just saw and decided to read on a whim, and I'm so happy I did, because it ended up being one of the only books that I've read for the last 3 months. And I thought it was really, really sweet to read. And then the last book that I fully read is called The Parlour Wife, and it's by Foluso Agbaje, and it's a Nigerian historical fiction book that takes place in the 1930s and 40s. It's about a girl called Kehinde. And if you don't know, in Nigeria, specifically in the Yoruba tribe, twins have names that they are typically called. Not everybody names their child these names, but a lot of people do. So the older twin is called Taiwo, and the younger twin is called Kehinde. This book is Kehinde's story. Kehinde is the younger twin, and the girl, she comes from a set of fraternal twins, her older twin brother, Taiwo. And this story starts out right before the Second World War, and Nigeria is still a colony at this stage, because Nigeria gained independence in 1960. And then we see a young girl who is grappling what it means to be a woman from Nigeria at the time, but I think a woman that is particularly from a lower economic background. She is very smart, very bright, but she had to stop going to school because her parents couldn't afford to put both her and her brother through school after a certain point. So they chose her brother because they thought that he would have more of an opportunity given the fact that he was male. So she just basically, will go fishing with her dad. Her dad was a fisherman, and then her mom sold the fish that her dad would get in the market. And then the war starts, which obviously largely impacts the countries that Britain colonized at the time. And so she has to get married off in order to provide for her family. She has to abandon her dreams of being a writer so that she can help her family. This story follows a girl who didn't have very much choice in her life, who was, I guess, very subject to the patriarchal setup of not only the world, but Nigeria. And it's heartbreaking to see because on the one hand, it makes you appreciative of having been born in the era that you were born into. But at the same time, you realize that from the 1940s till now, even though there has been progress, there's still so far we have to go, and there are still so many girls to this day that can relate to what Kehinde was going through in this book. And it makes you very sad because on the one hand you can acknowledge the progress that we've made, but at the same time in today's climate it feels like we're going back. And it's amazing that books and texts like these exist, but there's so many people in the world that don't take them for the warnings that they are, for the lessons that they're teaching us. Another really interesting thing that I liked about this book is I have learned about the Second World War in the past, but it's always, I think, from the perspective of Britain and the people here and the soldiers. So it was particularly lovely to read a book about the impact of the Second World War from a country that was a colony at the time and the people in it, because I feel like there are not enough books, or at least I don't see enough books that focus on that time and how it would have affected people of a different country, and how people of a different country were essentially at the mercy of Britain at the time. And even though they essentially had nothing to do with the outbreak of the war, they paid heavy prices for it. And it's just another part of colonization that I don't think is talked about enough. So I'm very thankful that this book exists because of that, because it taught me a lot that I didn't know, which is so strange. And so it's one of those books that's extremely important, especially if you're Nigerian, it's extremely important. But even if you just want to get a perspective that you may not have read about or seen or heard, it's important for those reasons. Kehinde was a complex character. She starts out this book as a 17-year-old, nearly 18-year-old. I love the fact that she felt very complex, very real. There was a part of her that was so driven and stubborn, but for good reason, because she could see the injustices around her and she resented it, as she should. But there was also a part of her that was inclined to follow the status quo, to not cause any problems. But then she quickly realizes that being like that doesn't really serve her. And so she takes as much power as she can get with what she has. And I think that unrelenting spirit about her was my favorite thing about her. She fell so many times, but she got up and she knew her mind, and she made mistakes because obviously she had no guidance in order to achieve for herself. So she kind of had to figure that out for herself, and I absolutely loved it. So this book is amazing. I would love to read more books by Foluso Agbaje, because if I'm not mistaken, this is a debut, and there is something about somebody releasing their first book and having it be just phenomenal. There's certain things I didn't really like, maybe sometimes the pacing of it, and some things felt slightly repetitive, but at the same time I don't really hold new authors to that high of a standard because I just think it's unfair. But also even authors that have been in the game for longer, there's very few perfect books. So even sometimes when I can acknowledge sort of imperfections with a certain story, it doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it or I hold it against them to such a point where I can't see the rest of the story. It was very inspirational, and it definitely made me acknowledge the privilege that I've had since childhood up till now. It's a good reminder that even while we've made progress, we still have a long way to go before we reach equality, especially in Nigeria. But it's also a really good lesson about how so many people are affected by single events, and there is a reason why people are vehemently opposed to wars, because they destroy lives and they have long-lasting impacts on people that don't go away overnight, and the trauma can still be felt decades later. And we need to do everything in our power to avoid wars because they cost, and the people that they cost most are the people who don't even have anything to do with why they even started in the first place. I feel like reading Nigerian fiction in particular kind of makes me feel a bit more connected to home, especially because this was based in Lagos and I'm from Lagos, so it's lovely to read a book based there and be able to sort of recognize names that I've heard all through my life or foods. Whenever I read a Nigerian book, it triggers memories in me, which I love. And I don't feel homesick too often, but sometimes I do, and reading books like these help. It has brilliant side characters as well, like Kende's family, her friends, the people who helped her as well. I absolutely despised her husband, but he was a man of his time and a man of his upbringing and culture and tradition, and he's very much a stereotypical Nigerian man that I can recognize. So while his character wasn't surprising, he was still disappointing, and those are pretty much my thoughts. It's a brilliant book. I highly suggest you pick it up. It's a really eye-opening, beautiful book full of pain and injustice, but also heart and warmth and kindness in the most unexpected of places. I want to talk about the book that put me in a slump, because I want to entirely blame this book for being the reason why I've had such a horrible last 3 months. And this book is called The Invisible Life of Addie, LaRue. This book is long. This book is verbose, but this book has nothing to offer. I think this is the book version of a word salad. I think it's the book version of somebody who says a lot but doesn't really say anything at all. And it was such a struggle to get into this book. I tried listening to it and I tried reading it simultaneously and separately. It didn't help. I just couldn't get immersed in this story. And it started off well because I thought it was a really interesting premise to have this girl who didn't want to get married, who wanted to have a life that matched her dreams and her expectations and just wanted more for herself. I always think characters like that are interesting because I think I'm one of those people where if I was born at a certain time, I would definitely have been rebellious because I wouldn't have agreed with this is all life has to offer me. First of all, I struggled to get immersed in it. And I just didn't feel emotionally connected to any of the characters. At some point, I just stopped caring about the story. It just wasn't making sense. You just felt like all she did was be invisible and fall in love with a bunch of people, and it just kept on going on and on. Granted, I didn't read the book in its entirety because I couldn't and I DNF'd, but I just felt like we were going nowhere. How would I describe it? It just wasn't giving. Let me be very Gen Z, and I don't know whether it gets better or not. I'd be interested to know from the people who have read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, did you like it? And what did you like? Because I can see the promise of the story, and like I said, I think it's interesting, but I just feel like enough wasn't done to make it worthwhile. But then at the same time, I feel like, am I being too harsh? Because at the end of the day, this follows a person who was essentially invisible to the entire world and was basically immortal. And I think that would be a really, really difficult life for anybody, especially when it's not technically what you chose. So maybe I am being too harsh and maybe my expectations are too high. I kept on trying to like it, trying to read it, desperate to get to the end so that I could have something to say. But I just realized really quickly that it wasn't for me. And I ended up paying for it because I have read 3 books in 3 months, which is abysmal, to be honest. And it's largely because I kept on trying and trying and trying to read this book and failing and failing and failing until I DNF'd. There's a lesson to be taken from this. It's definitely don't force yourself to read a book, because this is what you get when you do that. You then miss out on amazing stories that you could have otherwise read because you're being stubborn. So take it from me, guys. Do better for yourself. If you're reading a book and you don't like the story, let it go. Even if it's very popular and you feel like you should read it because of that reason. Don't do it. Don't be like me. Be better. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is not going to be a very long video because your girl has not read that much between the months of December and February. But I do hope that when I do my March reading wrap up, there's a bit of an upgrade from 3 books. I'm very, very thankful that I haven't put a reading goal for this year because we would be very, very behind if I had. If you're also struggling with a reading slump, make sure to tell me because I don't like to feel alone, okay? So if you are struggling with the same thing, definitely let me know. If you read any of these books, let me know what you thought about them. If you have any recommendations, feel free to let me know what they are and I'll put them in my ever-growing TBR. I've had this page for a while, and even though it's not a big page, therefore I haven't reached that kind of exposure where people are kind of mean or rude. I have been met with so much kindness and I appreciate it so much. We are growing steadily, which is exciting to see. If you just let me know what you'd like to see from me, that would be great, because that actually does give a lot of guidance as to where the page is going. If you could just like, comment, and subscribe, I would appreciate that because they mean so much and they help not only with exposure but also support for the channel as well. So thank you very much, and I will see you when I see you. Bye bye.